Free markets are better than central planning. This has got to be the closest thing to an ironclad fact anywhere in any of the social sciences. When it comes to organizing a society, there's just no contest. I mean, consider the obvious examples. North Korea relies more on central planning. South Korea relies more on free markets. Which would you rather live in? Mainland China relies more on central planning. Hong Kong relies more on free markets. Pick one. How about Venezuela or Chile? All are pairs of similar societies which would be very comparable were it not for the utter failure of central planning when compared to free markets. This trend isn't only visible when you look at extreme examples like communist and socialist states that attempt to eschew markets altogether. It's also visible when you just simply compare more regulated economies with freer economies. The Fraser Institute releases an annual report on the most economically free countries. That is, the countries with the least government control, the strongest protection of property rights, the least government manipulation of currency, the fewest restrictions on international trade, and the least regulation of business. They then divide these countries into quartiles. Most free, second most free, third most free, and least free. And on the cover of their report, color each country according to its quartile. I'm sure you've already noticed the deep shade of red of the countries you least want to live in, and the light blue shade of the countries you most want to live in. We can also compare the quartiles to various other metrics. For example, if we take a look at average income, we can see a mighty correlation with economic freedom. Perhaps you'd complain that this is just average income. How do we know that isn't just a few rich guys pulling up the average while the poor suffer? Well, here's how. Even if you only take into account the income of the bottom 10% of earners in each country, the correlation still holds strong. The freer the market, the better off the poor are. Well, that may be, you say. But there's more to life than just money. And, well, that may be, but having more money certainly isn't bad. And in any case, economic freedom is also correlated with factors like longer life expectancy, lower infant mortality, hell, even happiness as reported by survey for what that's worth. The empirical evidence is absolutely clear. Something small, say the size of a family or at most a company, can use something like central planning with some degree of success. But as soon as you try to centrally plan an entire economy, or even if a firm gets too big, I mean, look up diseconomies of scale, central planning as an organizational strategy simply breaks down. Markets, however, seem to scale up to any size with astounding efficiency. But why? It might be helpful here to put simply what the difference between these two approaches is. The fundamental problem that both try to solve is what is to be produced, with what resources, and by whom. Production here is defined as broadly as possible to include anything that we might value, including intangible things such as safety or pleasure. The central planning answer to this question is that someone, or some specific organization, should decide what is to be produced, what resources used to produce it, and then command all the correct people to perform all the correct parts of production. The alternative is the market solution. In this system, everything is owned by different individuals, starting with their own labor. The only control is that individuals are prevented from acquiring anything from other individuals unless that other individual voluntarily relinquishes it. The result of the first half of that is that individuals determine for themselves what they will do. The result of the second half is that individuals will be incentivized to apply their labor and other resources to things that others want, in exchange for others doing the same for them. Your initial reaction to this might be that it would be terribly disorganized. I mean, surely all of the coordination between those different parties is going to be horrible. But that clearly isn't the case. I mean, evidence, everything that you use on a daily basis, from tangible products to organizations and associations produced through this decentralized and naturally emerging system, which, when you think about it, is really rather incredible. I mean, you are right now living in an immeasurably complex system with nobody planning it. A classic way of impressing this upon people is the famous essay called I, Pencil by economist Leonard Read. In it, Read asks us to consider a humble pencil. He then makes the initially shocking claim that nobody in the world knows how it is made. If that sounds dubious, remember that to get a pencil you need wood. To get wood, you need chainsaws. To run chainsaws, you need oil. To get oil, you need oil rigs. To get oil rigs, you need engineering. And I've only followed one direction from each node in this tree. I could also have pointed out that to get pencils, you also need graphite. Or to get chainsaws, you also need steel. The result is that you have literally millions of people who are involved in the production of a pencil. And you can get pencils for less than $1. That is mind-bending efficiency at an impossible scale. Furthermore, each node affects every other. If people's demand for pencils slightly decreases for whatever reason, then it's no longer efficient to train so many engineers to design oil rigs. The effect will be small, but so will be the effect of everything on everything else in the economy. But it all needs to be considered in order to determine the most efficient structure of production. I'm sure you can see at this point why central planning cannot possibly work to allocate resources efficiently and produce for all of the needs of society. Even regulation that seeks to intervene in the economy in such a way as to better allocate resources than the free market already has is revealed as just a pipe dream. It requires calculation of far too many things, many of which a central government has no plausible way of knowing, like the constantly changing subjective experiences and preferences of everyone in the economy. Incidentally, it's also why companies don't grow and grow to the point where they encompass the entire economy. At some point, the organization of all of the facets required gets so complicated that it overwhelms any economy of scale the firm might have, and so it starts to lose efficiency. See diseconomies of scale. But it should be equally clear how simply and elegantly this problem is solved by a market. You decide that you need a pencil, and therefore you are willing to give up some portion of your resources in order to obtain one. The more urgent your need for a pencil, the more you will be willing to give up in order to obtain it. The more people want pencils and the more they're willing to pay to get them, the more profit there will be for pencil manufacturers to produce them. The more that pencil manufacturers make, the more they'll be able to spend on the resources required to make the pencils. The more that they spend on the resources required to make the pencils, the more profit there is to be made producing those resources, and so on. Nobody needs to somehow determine all of the varying preferences of every single person in the economy, weigh up their intensities, and consider all compromises, evaluate all available options using complete knowledge of every field in production. No. Each person simply needs to make the decision which accrues him the most profit. If your current attempt at being productive is not netting you any profit, that can only mean that people are not willing to pay for your work more than it costs you to perform it. So switch jobs, or investments, or whatever it is you do to make a living. If what you're doing, however, is turning a profit, then congrats. You are making the world a better place. People would only be willing to pay for what you're doing if they valued what you're doing more than it costs them to purchase it. But of course, if you're making an awful lot of profit by working in that field, then that's going to attract other people to that field. The competition will bid down the prices towards the cost of production until profits in the area fall enough so that there is no longer an incentive to enter your market above any others, and voila! The things which people want more get produced more. The more efficient production methods win out over the less efficient, and it is all achieved simply by people following the incentives laid down by market prices. The market is a system for turning your desire into a signal. That signal then propagates throughout the entire economy, slightly altering the incentives in industries spanning the entire world. Now, having stated that markets fulfill the values of those involved and central planning does not, I want to walk both of those claims back a bit. First, there is not absolutely zero impact from people's values on the behavior of a central government. Democracy, for example, provides some incentive for the government to behave in the correct way, and some information about what that correct way is. Politicians want votes, so they are incentivized to behave in a way which will get them. Second, there is a class of problems that critics of the free market will point to called externality problems. The basic idea is that it's a situation in which the cost or benefit of someone's actions goes to a different person. One example is spam emails. Receiving spam emails imposes a cost on everyone who doesn't want to receive them, but the action is taken by someone who only receives the benefit of that action, namely the Zimbabwean prince or penis pill producer or whatever. Therefore, the action is taken even if its cost to everyone outweighs the benefit, because Everyone isn't the one deciding whether or not to take the action. Another example often given is the pollution of a river. The polluter gets the benefit of running whatever machine polluted the river, but the people who use the water from that river get the costs. Therefore, they say, the actor is incentivized to take the wrong action. This second example is a little dubious, however, as it ignores the question of who owns the river. If we assign property rights for the river to some third party, the problem goes away. The owner of the river simply sells the rights to use the river to whichever party will pay the most for it. And now the use of the river is determined by the market based on the net values of everyone involved, just like everything else. For most externalities problems, there is a free market solution. But not all of them. The spam email example and some others are perfectly legitimate criticisms of the free market. However, they're much better criticisms of the government, because in general, people do pay the costs for their actions on the market, and in general, people involved in government do not. It costs a lot in terms of time and effort to become an informed voter, but your vote as an individual has almost no impact on the policy that you will be under. You're relying on millions of others agreeing with you, therefore you are not incentivized to become informed about policy. On the other hand, your purchasing decisions have a roughly 100% chance of affecting which goods and services you receive, and therefore you are incentivized to become informed about them. And because the voters are not incentivized to be informed and make prudent votes, the politicians are not incentivized to make good policy. On the other hand, because consumers are incentivized to make good purchasing decisions, business owners are incentivized to produce high-quality goods and services. And even to the extent that we do have influence over government behavior, we face externality problems at every turn. If I can get the government to ban something I don't like, I'm not paying the cost. The people who like that thing are. If I vote for a subsidy for my profession or industry, I don't bear that cost. The taxpayers do. And yes, I am a taxpayer myself, but given sufficient subsidies, I may not be a net taxpayer, and will at least be less of a taxpayer. Far from being the knockdown to the free market that they're often presented as, externalities problems are more of a knockdown to democracy. They're the reason that referring to democracy really doesn't do anything to make governments look any better than free markets. Externalities problems are sometimes faced by the market, but they're the norm with governments, including democratic ones. They are problems that will only be solved to the extent that people are willing to go against their selfish incentives and be altruistic. An underrated solution in my view, but definitely not an ideal one. So, to avoid excessive externalities, we should diminish the role of the system which is essentially made of them: government. Making this comparison between the free exchange of goods and services that we call a market and its only real alternative has led many, myself included, to libertarianism. Libertarianism is the political philosophy of individual liberty, private property rights, and reduced governments, aka reduced central planning. A common path of reasoning goes that since voluntary exchange leads to results so much better than what government can provide, we should limit the government to performing only what is necessary for that free market to exist. Namely, the government's only function should be to protect property rights. There is a glaring problem with this conclusion. We've established that markets will predictably outperform governments in the production of goods and services. But protection of property rights is also a service. Doesn't it follow that the market would produce that service better as well? Given the presumption in favor of markets that I've been defending so far, if we can use markets to uphold the very property rights within which those markets operate, then we should. But how could that possibly work? The clearest vision of this that I've seen comes from economist David D. Friedman's seminal work, The Machinery of Freedom. The basic idea is that each person contracts with a private agency which protects his or her property. If you steal something from someone, or damage his property, his agency will send officers to your house to demand you return his property or give up something of equivalent value to him, plus an additional payment to both him and the agency for their trouble. Everyone in the society knows that he is protected in this way, and therefore people are incentivized to respect his property rights. You might notice that this is much the same method of property rights enforcement we have now through the government-monopolized police force. The current police force threatens to harm those who violate our property rights through fines, jail time, and other punishments, and thereby people are incentivized to respect our property rights. The crucial difference is that the current police force compels you to finance them via taxes, whereas you would contract with the proposed rights enforcement agencies voluntarily. Therefore, just like every other enterprise on the market, they would need to provide you with the best protection at the lowest price, or else you will switch your subscription to a competing enforcement agency. Upon hearing this, the obvious allegation is that I've just described a recipe for constant war. After all, if you and another person both think you're the rightful owner of the same thing, your agencies are now committed to fighting a war with one another over their customers' conflicting property claims. That allegation is obvious and wrong. A war is an expensive way of resolving a dispute. Therefore, the agencies which find a better way to resolve their conflicts will be more profitable. One such way is arbitration. The two companies will know that these conflicts are bound to occur, so in advance they will make agreements to use an independent arbitrator who will determine who rightfully owned the contested item. The popular defense agencies would be the ones able to guarantee their customers a certain set of property rights. Therefore, they would need to have a strong portfolio of agreements with other defense agencies to use well-respected arbitrators who operate by rules that people like. Some people immediately insist upon hearing this, that the rules would simply cater to the rich, and the masses would have little to no protection. The reason I don't see this as likely is that it's not what we see in other industries. The most successful restaurant companies, the most successful car companies, the most successful retail companies, they don't cater primarily to the rich. Far from it. They cater to the average person. Therefore, in a society with this kind of enforcement, we should expect the rules by which property rights are determined to be the rules which provide maximum net benefit to the most people. This is law being produced on the private market, and the system is known as Anarcho-capitalism. And a person who supports this view is known as an anarcho-capitalist, or ANCAP for short. Of course, this description of and justification for a free society is cut down to very simple proportions, so I'm going to recommend Machinery of Freedom by David D. Friedman, either the 23-minute video version or the full book, depending on how much time you're willing to put into it. But even if you're only willing to sit through this little video by little old me, then I hope that I've at least been able to persuade you that we should be moving in the direction of freedom and markets and individual property rights. If so, then you are to some extent at least a libertarian. Congrats! And if you're willing to agree that the prospect of getting all the way to a free society as I've described it is at least somewhat plausible and desirable, then you are at least to some extent an ANCAP. And if you would like to increase that extent, then subscribe to my channel for further ANCAP propaganda, read Machinery of Freedom by David D. Friedman, and preferably move to a platform in the middle of the ocean and stockpile McNukes. All rights are property rights, taxation is theft, Mercatus Volt.